Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a great morning so far. I know Bridget had an awesome talk, so I hope you got to attend that as well. We've got a great session coming up here as well, so I'm going to kick it over to Claire, who is a junior studying neuroscience and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame, who will be taking care of this session. So Claire, over to you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Gender and Identity panel. Today, we have two presenters, an hour and 15 minutes for both of them to present, as well as for Q&A. So first up is Rhona Conway-Kenny from Leiden University, and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Bear with me there one moment. So my name is Rhona, and I'm a master's student at Leiden University in the Netherlands. I just finished up there, but I'm actually based in Dublin. So the topic for my presentation today is women in peace, passive observers or meaningful participants. And I wanted to examine whether the inclusion of women in peace negotiations affects the level of female political participation in post-conflict states. So first of all, the role of women in peace was kind of always at the forefront of my mind. Growing up in Ireland, I was always very conscious of the role of women in championing peace in Northern Ireland. People like Monica McWilliams and May Blood and the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Women played such a vital part of that peace negotiation process, which has resulted in kind of what is considered to be one of the most successful peace negotiation processes of certainly my lifetime. So those support for the idea that women should be involved in the peace building process is almost unanimous. I noticed that insufficient consideration had been given to how this involvement affects women in the longer term, especially in relation to their political engagement. So identifying if and how women's involvement in the peace negotiation process impacts subsequent political participation is central for underscoring the full value of including women in the peace process and may actually aid our understanding of the political legacies of the conditions under which peace is negotiated. So the paper itself attempts to build a theory about the relationship between women's involvement in peace negotiations and subsequent levels of political participation. It aims to consider whether involvement in the peace negotiation matters at all and whether the type of involvement has varying degrees of impact. So the way that it actually does that is by theorizing that women's inclusion in the peace process affects the rate of political participation in two main ways. The first one is by causing a shift in cultural norms relating to the role of women as political actors. And the second is by altering the content of the agreement itself. So personally, the interaction between policy development and academia is very important to me. I believe that any decisions made by governments or international organizations should be based on sound academic evidence. And personally, I found that to be lacking in this area. So United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000 on women, peace and security was the first time that it was acknowledged that female involvement was necessary in all aspects of the peace building process. Yes, almost 22 years on, the majority of ongoing or recent peace negotiation processes fails to include women. I noticed in the existing literature that the underrepresentation of women in peace negotiations had been highlighted as an issue, but it was within the broader sphere of gender equality, and there was very little discussion on how this translated to impacting women specifically. The focus on women's utility to peace in a more general context, again, and how it impacted the stability and durability of peace in its totality is present in the literature. But again, it tends to be based on a kind of outdated notion that women are more inherently peaceful and that they can benefit a peace process, but rarely is it discussed how it actually benefits women specifically. Again, the existing literature focuses on the numerous barriers which restrict women's involvement in actually getting to the peace negotiation process, but thereafter it does not tend to consider what happens when these barriers are overcome and the longer term effects of female political participation in post-conflict states. So the theory itself, I adopted a theory building approach in the absence of any sort of existing theoretical framework. And the aim is to trace the mechanisms that link the inclusion of women in peace negotiations and the levels of female political participation, as opposed to simply establishing correlation between the two. I think it's important to note that I'm not trying to deduce concrete conclusions on whether the involvement of women directly impacts levels of female political participation in the post-conflict environment, but rather to identify the relationship and the potential connection between the two. The theory itself illustrates the necessity for female involvement in the development of any peace agreement if gender advancement in political participation is the ultimate aim. So in terms of research design and methodology, the study is conducted using a causal process tracing approach. The term negotiator should be understood to represent participants in or parties to a final round of talks resulting in a signed agreement. And the term mediator should be understood to be a third party that assists two or more opposing protagonists to prevent, manage, or resolve a conflict by helping them develop mutually acceptable agreements. The cases examined are the Côte d'Ivoire, Zimbabwe, and Kenya for formation of the theory. For the term of political participation, it should be understood to mean women in political elected positions. The focus on elected positions is twofold. In practical manner, the existing data is more accessible and reliable, and it is definitively measurable variable. Building on this, I thought it was quite important to bring in Jane Mansbridge's idea of representative politics, and that is actually having women represent women can in itself be beneficial, and having the idea of having a more representative government can actually lead to a better functioning democracy. And so the data was sourced from the Interparliamentary Union's Women in Politics reports, and for comparative purposes, the study focused on women in single or lower houses of parliament. So the first question was whether female participation in peace negotiation processes mattered in terms of longer term political participation. The first empirical analysis was conducted on the cases of Côte d'Ivoire and Zimbabwe. And these cases have many contextual similarities, but one major difference. In the peace negotiations in Côte d'Ivoire, there was no female involvement, whereas women were included in the peace process in the role of negotiator in Zimbabwe. These cases were deliberately selected in order to illustrate how even minimal involvement in peace negotiations may have a lasting impact on women's political participation thereafter. It was considered and discussed that potentially having a comparative study where women partook in all roles, being signatories, mediators, and negotiators, may be beneficial. But given that that is such a rarity, and that it is so unusual for women to be participants in all different roles, would kind of limit the generalizability of the theory and provide less empirical evidence. Because while those cases do exist, it's extremely rare. So in the Côte d'Ivoire, the Lina Marquis Peace Accords was a comprehensive agreement adopted in 2003. There were no women involved in the creation of the agreement. Prior to the agreement, 8% of total parliamentarians were female, with this rising to 12% 5 years post-agreement. In Zimbabwe, the global political agreement, the agreement for the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front and the two Movement for Democratic Change formations on resolving the challenges facing Zimbabwe, was adopted in 2008. In this peace negotiation process, 17% of negotiators were female. Prior to the agreement, 18% of total parliamentarians were female. And in the 5-year post-agreement period, this almost doubled to 31.9%. So while I'm not arguing that this is the only reason for the increase, this does provide a basis for theorizing observable implications of female involvement in peace-building activities and to identify the causal mechanisms of this potential relationship. So having established that it may matter, the type of involvement was the next natural question. So this empirical analysis considered the cases of Zimbabwe and Kenya. Both Zimbabwe and Kenya adopted their peace agreements in 2008 following periods of political violence stemming from contested elections. So in Kenya, prior to the creation of the peace agreement in 2007, in Kenya, 7.2% of total parliamentarians were female. This increased to 21.8% by 2020, which displays a threefold increase in the 12 years since the adoption of the agreement. While Zimbabwe ranks higher in the Interparliamentary Union's Women in Politics report, being that it has a higher percentage of female parliamentarians, what I'm interested in is the increase since the adoption of the peace agreement, which has been much more rapid in Kenya than in Zimbabwe. So how I imagine this has happened is through a shift in cultural norms. In Zimbabwe, prior to the peace agreement, women rarely participated in political activities. Where women did participate, they were often limited and had little influence on policy formation. So if women did break the mold and actually engage in political activities, they were often sectioned to a women's wing or given no real impact. Society did not view women as legitimate political actors. In Kenya, there was a strong grassroots movement of women engaged in political activities. However, this rarely translated to actual representation in a parliamentary setting or any real influence beyond kind of local communities. Again, societal expectation prior to the peace agreement was of women as a homemaker, which limited their ability to participate fully in politics. So the shift in cultural norms then occurred as a result of the involvement of women in the peace negotiation process. The campaign for women in Zimbabwe in 2008 illustrates how women overcame social and cultural obstacles. The fact that women can and do participate in politics in a manner equal to their male counterparts is a change from the pre-peace negotiation political landscape. Similarly, in Kenya, female involvement in the peace negotiation process demonstrated the capability and competence of women in the political sphere. Significant cultural changes have also occurred to ensure that access to parliamentary participation is more possible for women. This can be viewed in the fact that in Kenya, women can now bring their young children with them when traveling for committee work, and that the Parliament has adopted a gender-sensitive focal point. Obviously, this is a simplified version of events, and there are other variables at play beyond the scope of this paper, but what we wanted to acknowledge was that this may be a necessary consideration. So engagement of women in the peace-building process can therefore transform the cultural understandings of what the role of women is and create a space for women to participate as political actors. Further, conflict resolution may have a transformative effect on women's political participation by creating vacancies or a shift in demographics. In times of political violence or civil war, vacancies are often created when men leave to go to fight, but the research shows that even when the war is ended or the violence is resolved, and men return to take their patriarchal place as the head of the household, that actually the socioeconomic and political participation effects remain. So the mechanism that has been identified is that female inclusion in the peace negotiation process causes a change in cultural norms regarding the role of women, which in turn leads to increased levels of female political participation. In this way, the cultural norms influences political participation or lays the groundwork for election to parliamentary positions. The second way in which female involvement in the peace negotiation process may affect longer-term political participation is through the content of the agreement. Female involvement in the peace negotiation process may not always have direct impacts on the content of agreement by ensuring specific provisions. Oftentimes, in the aftermath of conflict, the actual peace agreement itself is not the most appropriate vehicle for outlining specific provisions in relation to gender sensitive legislation. However, the content of the agreement may actually present a framework under which levels of female political participation can be increased. And in this way, it's the attendance and involvement of women at the peace negotiation process that actually is reflected in the longer term. So the paper proposes that the female involvement in the peace negotiation process influences the inclusion of the relevant provisions and ensures the adoption of a more gender-inclusive agenda for the proceedings. Further, these necessary provisions may be omitted where women are not included. So in the Côte d'Ivoire, there is almost no reference to women, girls, or gender in the Lina Marcoussis peace agreement. And this is perhaps unsurprising given that there were no women present at the drafting or negotiation process of the agreement. In Zimbabwe, the global political agreement is actually a somewhat of an outlier in that it explicitly references the need for gender equality in many facets of society, including the need to appoint women to strategic cabinet posts. As a result of having female negotiators, the increased communication flow resulted in due consideration being given to the rights and roles of women within society. In Kenya then, the agreement does not explicitly reference gender, but it does set the foundations for the drafting of a new constitution and the establishment of truth and reconciliation commissions and inquiries. Gender quotas were imposed for all peace implementation commissions, which include the Constitutional Reform Commission, the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, and the National Cohesion and Integration Commission. Graça Michel, as mediator, partook in regular consultation with the Kenyan Women's Consultation Group, which is therefore reflective of the participation of women in the negotiation process. Similarly, the Constitution of 2010, which was established as a result of the peace agreement, imposes a 1/3 quota for female representation in elective and appointed positions. The paper therefore theorizes that the involvement of women at the negotiation stage of the peace process broadens the overall agenda and contributes to the creation of subsequent legislation and legal frameworks which support increased levels of female political participation. Enabling the development of gender-sensitive legislative frameworks and structures which support increasing levels of women in political settings can arise from the peace process, even where it is not explicitly codified within the accord. The mechanism that has been identified is female inclusion in peace negotiations causes a broader agenda considering women's rights, which therefore influences subsequently developed legislation and legal frameworks, in turn causing increased levels of female political participation. In essence, it is the peace negotiation process which sets in place reforms and institutions which can have long-term effects on gender equality, women's empowerment, and peace, as Olsen and Krauss put in their most recent publication. So, the lack of data and small number of cases wherein there has been significant involvement of women in the peace negotiation process poses difficulty in providing reliable evidence of its effects on women's female political participation thereafter. It's actually quite difficult to determine whether the type and extent of involvement, that is, whether women participate at all or participate in the role of negotiator, mediator, or signatory, has influence on the level of female political participation. Occasionally, it's more obvious that where women have been deliberately excluded previously, the vision of any women actively participating within the peace negotiation process, regardless of their role, may signify a shift in their perception as political actors. Building on that, it's actually kind of the space for the structural and institutional changes occur in the peace negotiation process. And this, as I mentioned, is through a changing of cultural norms and the impact of women in the peace negotiation process on the actual agenda. So future research regarding ongoing peace processes or following the implementation of more recent agreements may provide further insight and support of this theory. Even today, only a tiny percentage of United Nations peacebuilding aid is directed towards women's participation in peace negotiations. However, this is beginning to change. Recently, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, in work with the UN, have launched a rapid financing tool in order to accelerate women's participation in peace negotiation processes across the globe. Similarly, Conciliation Resources have formed a database of suitably qualified female mediators for international organizations or governments to utilize in the peace negotiation process. And these are just kind of two examples of a wide range of work that is ongoing at the moment. So we would expect in the future, hopefully, to see more women involved in the peace negotiation process, which will provide further data and therefore our ability to test this theory in a wider range of situations, which will provide evidence in support or against the mechanisms proposed. Of course, there are many other reasons for increased female political participation in post-conflict environments, some of which are beyond the scope of this paper. But I do believe that involving women from the peace negotiation process does have lasting effects, and that is something that is overlooked and will become more important as we begin to move the needle on peace. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Rhona. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. I can start us off. I was wondering, you said Zimbabwe's agreement explicitly references gender equality. I was wondering if that meant that they specifically mentioned women or if it was all gender equality.
Yeah, no, it is specifically women. I don't have the actual agreement in front of me, but it notes that there is a need for actually creating space for women in what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, in the parliamentary settings in strategic cabinet posts.
Gotcha. Awesome. Yeah. So now we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. Feel free to put questions in the chat. Okay. Actually, we'll give everyone time to collect their thoughts, and we'll go on to the next presentation and then open it up to a Q&A for both presenters. So next we have Camila Farfán from Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, and she'll be presenting on violence discourses and gendered language learners' identity in the EFL classroom, a Colombian case. So take it away.
Okay, hello, good morning, afternoon. Well, so as you mentioned, the name of my presentation is Balanced Discourses and Gendered Language Learners' Identities in the English as a Foreign Language Classroom. I am a teacher, and I carry out two research processes, one in a preschool context and the other one on an adult learner's context. So I will show you a little bit about both of them. So, okay, to start, I want you to reflect about two questions. The first one is, where do you think gender discourses come from, and how those discourses can be balanced? So think about those questions for a couple of seconds, and well, we are going to discuss them later. So, well, this is the agenda. Basically, I'm going to provide some information about the first research I did, the context and the problem, as well as the research question. I will tell you a little bit about the theoretical background, the methodology I follow, some partial results, analysis, conclusion, and final thoughts. So, well, it was 2011, and I started my bachelor on mother languages. I was a teacher in a preschool context, and I tried to identify how some gender discourses permeated the classroom and how they affected the learning and the teaching of a second language. So this first extract, basically the teacher was explaining or was teaching colors, and she asked one female student to answer one question. She didn't answer, and because of that, the teacher was categorized as bad behaved, that she was not paying attention, that she was distracted with some bad characteristics. And what I found is that there are some stereotypes about what boys or how boys and girls should perform. So boys can be more spontaneous if you want, or they can be more talkative, they can perform in a more open way, they can they can disrupt the class, for example, if they want, but also they can have these female attributes as well, and that would be okay, like well-behaved, paying attention, following the rules. But when a girl doesn't follow these stereotypes, well, they can be judged they can be strongly judged by the teacher who is in charge of the class. Now, the second extract took place while students were learning about school supplies, and the teacher was showing different elements. Teacher showed one pencil case, and she asked one female student to answer or to mention what the object was. Instead of Andrea, who was the female student, Diego, a male student, answered the question. In that case, and because Diego took Andrea's place, the teacher categorized Diego with some female characteristics, like, are you Andrea? Like, show me your buns, or show me your skirt. So, are you Andrea? Please ask me when I ask you to do so. So in this case, Diego was categorized with some female characteristics just because he wanted to interact in the class. What some heteronormative ideas. This qualification and disapproval discourses are influence the learning of a second language. So basically, learning a language is an act of communicating ideas. In this case, when they feel that their identities are in danger or that they are violated, they could hinder the process of learning a second language. And those discourses, like violent discourses, may come with violent manifestations that potentially influence the positioning of a student and his or her identity construction. Now, taking that into account, well, then I work in a language institute, as I mentioned, so I wanted to see if those discourses were the same, like if the same patterns appeared. I work with adult learners from age from 18 and up, from different social linguistic background. Students were divided into 6 different levels, from A1, which is basic level, till C1, which is advanced. And they were exposed to different books, videos, and authentic material that was created by the academic staff. When I got there, I noticed that students were exposed to different materials, as I mentioned. I will show you just one part of the video, maybe from, I don't know, second, 23rd, maybe. Well, in this case, men are watching a video, girls are discussing about the clothes they bought, and well, girls are showing the clothes they were shopping to their couples, basically. Nothing else happened. But this was the type of material students were exposed to. So I tried to identify, like, okay, maybe it is not the teacher, but the material is fully permeated by these heteronormative ways of being boys and girls, or how women should perform, and which practices are okay for women and men. I'm going to change to the next slide. So in that case, well, the problem of my investigation was to analyze how the English as a foreign language classroom can be permeated by gender unbalanced discourses, and how can they interfere on the construction of the gender identities as well as identities of learners of a second language. And well, the research question was to analyze which discourses build those gender identities in the classroom, and which are the possible impacts on the teaching and learning of a second language. This is just some theoretical framework. As you may know, there are different types of violence. So there is the one that is visible, that is the direct violence. Like, it could be physical aggression, verbal aggression, bullying, corporal punishment, or invisible, which is tacit, and it could be reproduced by the use of some discourse. UNESCO categorized the school-related gender-based violence into different categories, including physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, including corporal punishment, bullying, sexual violence and harassment, emotional abuse, discrimination, and well, in a country like Colombia, for example, it is very easy to notice. For example, girls, they suffer from different sorts of discrimination and limited access to education. Girls should stay at home taking care of their children, their little, well, they got pregnant in a very early age, or they have to take care of their little brothers or sisters. They have to take care or assume the household chores, for example, while parents are working. Or maybe they don't go to school because they don't have the money to buy um, like female products when they are on the menstrual period. So we that's something that many girls in Colombia have to go through. And also there are some other types of violence which boys suffer, including bullying and physical violence, not only in the school but outside the school. And we are talking just about boys and girls, but there are also some violent manifestation between non-heteronormative ways of positioning yourself, like in a gender perspective. We have to mention that gender is a category, or it is something that is socially constructed. We learn how to be boys and girls by some discourses and by some stereotypes that we hear since a very early age, as I mentioned. And because of some physical characteristics, you have to behave into some categories of femininity, sorry, or masculinity that society might bring or might give you. And as I mentioned, well, or here I state, those discourses position ourselves not only in an individual context, but also in a social context, and that reconfigure ourselves according to our experiences. So, well, the methodology I follow, I was the coordinator, the academic coordinator of the Language Institute in one of the branches around, like in one city here in Colombia, but I also was a teacher, so I have the chance to play both. Like I was interacting with the students and I have the chance to teach the lessons, but I had the chance to be part of the class as a student and to record the class. So basically, those recordings were transcribed and I analyzed them. For the analysis, I took 4 categories that emerged from the research questions, which were gender, balance, discourses, and learning. From the gender, I will explain this a little bit more, but some subcategories appeared, which were breaking gender stereotypes and gender stereotypes, violence, including minimizing, ignoring, segregating, and discourses, ignoring discourse, disapproval discourse, and student disapproval discourse. We will go deeper in a minute. And learning, peer student feedback, knowledge holder, and teachers feedback. As I told you, well, I will show you just 2 episodes. In the first one, students were learning about adjectives to describe people. So short, tall, young, old, well. And they have to fill the gaps with the correct adjective. And we have these 2 pictures. They were taken from the textbook students had. And maybe we can see, we cannot hear, but what happened, maybe we can go back a little bit. No, in the same slide, there is the transcription of the episode. Behind that picture, but well, basically they were describing that one. There you are. Well, this is what happened. They were describing this picture, and one student make fun because his girlfriend is very tall. That was the correct answer according to the book. And one student laughed because of that, and the teacher say like, yeah, that's super funny. Like, let's imagine me, that was a female teacher, like, let's imagine me, Mike, with a very tall guy. That would be super funny. And the student replied like, yeah, but in your case, that's beautiful because you're a woman. But in that case, like the one that is portrayed in the book, no. Why? Because it is a man, and men are supposed to be taller than their girlfriends, because it is believed, like socially speaking, that men should be taller and should protect their couples. So in that case, we see some gender stereotypes that the student brought into the class that she already had. Like, okay, how a woman should look like, or a man should look like, and how those relationship in terms of the construction of the body should emerge, or should be performed. Sorry. And there is also this case of the woman with the guy. Okay, his wife is, so the answer was young, but because the textbook in somehow tried to give like I don't know, students to use that adjective to describe this picture. When I was a teacher, I tried to give some other opportunities, like his girlfriend, his wife is so intelligent, talented, creative. Well, bad students most of the times reply that his wife is so young, and they try to or they reply like, yeah, like, why is a young woman dating with a old guy? Maybe there is something behind, you know. So those kind of comments appear in the classroom. So what do we see? There are some or maybe we can change. There are some gender stereotypes, and students may come or arrive into the classroom with some naturalized gender stereotypes, and they can emerge. The rupture of some of them can create segregation, minimization, and disapproval discourses in the English classroom. And those minimization and segregation discourses could hinder the learning process of of an English learner. Now let's take a look of the next one. The next one is basically there was a video, and in the video there were two girls and one guy. They were discussing how to take care of their appearance, and the boy replies like, "Well, I just use like shampoo." And I don't do anything else. I don't use any moisturizing or skincare product because I am a man. And for a man, it's okay not to take care that much attention of their appearance. So in this case, there was a male student, and the male student asked to his student, like, okay, guys, there were three boys in the class. Okay, what about a manicure? Like, will you get a manicure? And students replied like, no, no way. And the teacher replied again, like, well, I have to because my nails are horrible. So in that case, the teacher tried to show students that there are some other ways of being men, and there are some other ways of representing masculinity that maybe in a culture like Colombian culture are not okay. Like, it's okay for a man to not pay attention, too much attention to his physical appearance, and to be like very well, I don't know, but not to take care that much attention about the way they look. But for a woman, it's okay. So the teacher tried to show students some other ways of being boys, to be men, and show them that it is also okay to take care about their physical appearance, and that it doesn't affect their positioning their gender positioning. So we, in this case, teacher used interaction in the class to break those stereotypes and to try to promote a gender-free environment and to minimize the impact of breaking those gender stereotypes in the English language classroom. So, which were the results? Basically, there are some reproduction of gender stereotypes that are mostly perpetuated by materials and students which have naturalized them as normative and part of their social and individual construction. So, there were some differences. For preschoolers, those discourses are mostly perpetuated by the teacher, but in an adult context, materials and also some naturalized patterns may emerge in the class, reproducing some ways of being boys and girls or women or men in the class. Students might bring heteronormative ideas of what being a woman or a man is. So the role of the teacher is that of promoting a gender-free environment in the class. So open the possibility to integrate non-binary and heteronormative patterns, to open the door to some other ways to express their gender identity that breaks this binary positioning of female male, and promote an interaction and creating or providing students the opportunity to participate or to express their opinions and their gender identities, breaking also those positions of power between teacher and students, talking more in a feminist perspective, that will be or that might be beneficial, as students will feel free to express and to participate in the class. Now, also minimization practices and segregation discourses could hinder the learning process of a second language learner. And it is important to mention that this analysis was carried out in a very specific context, but that could be replicated into more general context. So we as teachers, we have to reconsider balance and its origin. We have to be aware of and use those emergent discourses in a positive way and not to the detriment of the learning process. And also act critically towards the discourses and the materials we use in the class, which could contain heteronormative ideas. But as I mentioned, we as teachers should give an analysis that can integrate some different perspectives of expressing our gender identity in the class.
Thank you so much, Camila. That was awesome. So now we have a good amount of time for Q&A if people want to put them in the chat. I can start us off with the question for Camila. I think your research was awesome, and the whole gender-free environments is a really interesting idea. And it's really good for breaking down the heteronormativity and being inclusive to all genders, including like non-binary and other genders. But I was wondering if that can also sort of lose the role of the feminist perspective, and if like the focus on women would kind of get lost in that gender-free environment.
I think that when we open the door to new possibilities to express our gender identity, we try to balance those positions of power, where there are some categories that are assumed as natural, like feminine, masculine, women, men, teacher, student. So when we try to break and create a gender-free environment, which all are in the same horizontal way, I think that we open the door to a more not only gender-free environment, but also to a, like in a feminist perspective, to break those imbalances or power relationships that maybe we perpetuate by categorizing elements in a binary perception. That's my perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have a question from the audience. How do you think classroom settings can play a role in developing effective female peace builders?
Well, we have to. It has to. We as teachers, we have to be aware that teaching practices and the interactions at school are very important. Students are in the class like for almost 8 hours a day. Uh, so in this is my perspective. I think that schools should promote or should reflect or should integrate this perspective of taking care of not only of ourselves but also in the community, like in a feminist perspective, like this theory of like taking care of the other. And in that way we start creating or teaching children that those roles that are assumed as in a private sphere that are given to women, the one of taking care, can be also transferred into a public sphere, like taking the classroom, like showing children that these practices of taking care of the other, of breaking or and integrating the other and breaking those power relationships could not only be in a private sphere but also in a public sphere. And in that way, when students start realizing that taking care not only about myself but the other, the community, it will be bigger and bigger, and that starts creating like peace builders somehow, because they start realizing that it's not only about me but it's also about the other, and it is also about doing something to transform the way we relate with the other.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So next question is, can structures of violence in school settings be transformed by the language of instruction? For example, if students interact a non-native language, do they shift their biases? I can repeat that if that was a lot.
Okay. Yeah.
So can structures of violence in school settings be transformed by the language of instruction? For example, if students interact a non-native language, do they shift their biases?
Well, I think that learning a second language is opening the door to new ways of relating with the others. Like when you learn a language, you are not only learning new words, you are also learning about about different cultures, about someone, different societies, different than mine. So, in that perspective, when we learn a language, we can also transform the way we see, and when we try to break the way again some stereotypes. We are talking about stereotypes of being boys and girls, but also when we have some stereotypes about different cultures. So when we learn that language, we also learn that we can relate with the other, breaking those stereotypes, leaving them behind, and giving and opening the door to new perspectives to interact with the other in a more dynamic and open way, like dialogical way. So learning a language is giving the people the possibility to communicate, dialogue, create dialogues that let you know more about someone else by using a second language. So a second language could break those structures, not only in um, gender perspective, but also in a cultural perspective that led me the chance to integrate new perspectives and new narratives and constructions of the world.
Thank you. So the next question is for Rhona. Thinking about the mechanism by which peace agreements produce more female participation in the post-conflict dispensation, how do peace agreements shape the concepts of women in society, and how does that filter down to the grassroots level?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I suppose the answer is kind of twofold. In my research, the mechanism that I proposed was that the female inclusion in the peace negotiation process kind of opened up more spaces for women to participate in political activities. But in saying that, in the cases that I had considered, it is that the grassroots movements were actually vital in getting women to the actual negotiating table, and I mean in two ways. Actually, having women at the table kind of leads to kind of more activities and increased female empowerment, but at the same time, in the absence of some of the kind of measures that are being introduced that I mentioned towards the end, in accelerating actual engagement at the negotiation stage, historically it has been necessary for women to actually create their own space to actually get to the table in the first place. And in that way, it is the grassroots movement that are so crucial. And so it kind of works both ways, that there does need to be kind of grassroots movements in order to get women to the peace negotiation table. But once they are there, again, it works back in creating more grassroots movements and ensuring that there is continued participation for women in all activities, not just representation. That was the focus of my project, but that's not to kind of do away with all the other forms of political participation that do occur, and that are just as vital and just as impactful in terms of empowerment and participation.
Awesome. Given the perpetuation of patriarchy in many traditional contexts, how do you think peace talks could include more females at the negotiation table?
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of a difficult one, because as I mentioned, where women are involved, it can actually change the culture. Of course, it's not going to do away with traditions and cultures that have been entrenched in these communities for so many years previous, but even just the small amount of space that is opened up has kind of lasting impacts. But in terms of actually getting women to the negotiation table in the first place, again, there's so much discussion on the barriers that women do face, and it is only now that we've kind of, as scholars, noticed that these need to be addressed kind of all at once. They can't be done individually. So those barriers, I mean, they range from childcare to education to kind of everything in between. And it is going to take concerted efforts to ensure that women actually do make it to the negotiation table. And as I mentioned, kind of some of those that are only beginning to emerge now, kind of 20 plus years after we identified the need for this to happen. And I mean, there are many other ways that this can happen. And I suppose we'll see the effectivity of these in the coming years as they kind of progress.
Thank you. And going off that, Camila, do you think that this is something that can be nurtured in classroom environments?
Yeah.
Getting females to the negotiation table.
Yeah, for sure. Like, in fact, when I was listening, I was hearing Rhona, I was thinking about like the peace process that took place in Colombia 5 years ago, and I think that it opened the door for children, and in this case for girls, also to empower and to have this voice, to recognize that they also have the chance to speak, to integrate new perspectives, and also to empower those girls to raise their voices against those violent manifestations or those violence that they might suffer. Here in Colombia, we see that, as I told you, like different and various ways of violence. not only because of these discourses that are reproduced, but also because we suffer from some strong direct violence that has impacted girls in a very direct way. So it is important that at school we let girls speak, and to that we give them the chance to create new alternatives, to include their perspective in the agenda if we want to keep through this peace building process that we want to, like a society.
Okay. Do you think that non-English language environments have a more challenging time with gender stereotypes given the use of masculine and feminine nouns in their respective languages?
I think it is not that we have a more challenging time. Well, I think that things are changing right now. Curricular designers are trying to include more um, ways of being in the word, not in a binary conception. But the role of the teacher, as I mentioned before, it is that of giving the possibility to express. It doesn't matter if the material, for example, as the one that we observe, because materials are one of the strongest barriers that we have, and that reproduces lots of discourses, gender discourses. But it's so is that of creating a gender-free environment for students to talk, and maybe trying to give an opportunity of communication, of integrating new perspective, talking, why not, about how those discourses can be broken, or how those stereotypes can be broken, and providing a wider and broader way of being, not in a binary conception. So I think it is not a challenge, or it is a challenge, but in a positive way, if we give students the possibility to discuss, or we give this language in the language classroom, we give the possibility to interact while talking about how we can integrate new perspectives of being.
Thinking about how education is the place where girls can be empowered and gain their voices, how important is the role of teachers? And do you believe there needs to be more done to support this relationship between the teacher and the student?
Yeah, I think that when we are trained for be teachers, we study lots of things about methodology, which is the best way, for example, in a language perspective, which is the best way to teach a language. Like, okay, is the natural approach, or is the grammar translation method, like these kind of methodologies. But we forget about what, well, the really important thing is, and is like interacting, like trying or learning a language, as I told you, is not about like learning new words and learning grammar, but it's about communicating and understand different ways of being. So when we think about teachers training, I think that there is a huge gap that needs to be filled with new ideas of interacting, and getting to, or trying to empower teachers to empower students in terms of how they can affect their own spheres, the social spheres, not only in a private way but in a public way, as I mentioned before. So I think that is one of the challenges that we have right now. Try to empower teachers to be elements, transformative elements in educational context.
Thank you so much. Rhona, what do you foresee as some of the biggest challenges over the next decade, particularly as conflicts intensify given increased scarcity in the world? If women are already at a disadvantage in many societies, where do you believe that local and global peace builders should focus their efforts?
Thank you. That's kind of a loaded question, I suppose. in terms of the biggest challenges that we tend to face in the next decade, I think climate-based conflicts are going to become even more important, kind of forced climate migration and issues like that. So whether these conflicts are resource-based or land-based, regardless, the climate is going to play a huge part in that. And I know you mentioned that women in so many societies are already at a disadvantage, but I mean, even in terms of that, when you add in conflict, we know that women suffer disproportionately to men in conflict, and we know that they suffer a kind of a wide range of different issues than men. I mean, a lot of the times conflict and the lasting effects of conflict in terms of actually on individuals can tend to be trauma based or physical based, but the issues that actually affect women specifically are kind of overlooked in general. So as to how kind of local and global peace builders should focus their efforts, that is on a case by case basis, I suppose. In terms of actually at the peace agreement stage, as I mentioned, we know women suffer disproportionately. So it might be a situation that instead of just kind of advancing gender equality, that the peace agreement could be a place for kind of restorative justice and actually purposely progressing the needs of women at that stage, and actually including necessary provisions and future insights into how this might actually affect it in the longer term, because a lot of the time peace agreements are kind of immediate ceasefires or just kind of the absence of conflict, but peace building actually does encompass an awful lot more than just the absence of war, and I think that's kind of what we need to be focused on.
And given your international experience and study of different peace environments, could you please speak to the importance of understanding cultural identities and norms in peace negotiations, particularly the role of women in these contexts?
Yes, so I actually had intended to kind of conduct interviews on this issue for my research paper, but unfortunately the pandemic kind of put a spanner in those works. But that was kind of another part that dictated the case selection for the study that I did, in that I wanted kind of culturally comparative contexts, and in terms of how women experience conflict in the Cote d'Ivoire, Zimbabwe, and Kenya, there are of course differences, but there are far more similarities, and kind of the role of women as a homemaker, as staying home, looking after the family, they kind of are similar across those three studies. Of course, this is different in different geographical locations and across different types of conflict. Those I'm not kind of an expert in, to be honest. But it is, I think, important to identify the existing cultural identities in terms of the role of women, and not to just impose our Western ideals of what a woman should be, because it does differ so differently across continents and even within states.
Thank you. Camila, looking forward, what is your hope for the future of education in terms of breaking down these gender stereotypes and creating a more just society?
Well, I think that the classroom is a space for transformation and creation of new ways of relating to the world, socializing, and also understanding one's identity and that of the others. So, as educators, or as teachers, we can propose different sorts of interaction and dynamics that lead to a better understanding of our ways of relating. And I think that's the key. So maybe we can build a more peaceful society or more inclusive, I don't know, but maybe we can transform. Yeah, we can transform our society by recognizing different narratives, different discourses, by allowing different discourses to take place in the schools, so we can create and propose different sorts of interaction that leads to an understanding of our environment and the connections that we create through pedagogical processes in the classroom. And these will allow not only to build knowledge, but also to create and to position ourselves in a social and individual perspective, in creating our identity, giving a broader vision of the other, so we can understand emotions, create connections, and build community in order to transform.
Thank you so much. We are coming up on time, so we're going to end with a question to both of you. Where do you guys hope to go in your peace building journeys from here?
Yeah, so I can go first, I suppose. I don't know. Yeah. So personally, I am quite passionate about the role of women and youth in the peace building process. And as I mentioned, in all peace building activities, as opposed to just stopping violent conflict, but actually the structural and institutional reforms that take place in the transformation towards more peaceful area. So I kind of hope to gain both practical and continued academic experience as I go forward.
Well, I'm going to talk about an educational perspective, but I think that it is very important to create new narratives, to recognize the other, to create spaces where children can recognize and consider not only the interest each one has, but also the one of all members of the community. So it is important to create spaces that gives students this opportunity to transform their realities and their own local context. So in that way, we can start creating small actions that can have a strong impact in the way we transform and we build community in a more peaceful and collaborative way. So the role of the education is very important for promoting new approaches or new ways on how we approach to the reality we live in.
Thank you both so much for sharing your research and your insights. We really appreciate you coming, and thank you to the audience for listening and all your amazing questions. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Claire, Camila, and Rhona. Awesome job. I hope you guys enjoyed that. It's just so enriching to hear all the research you've both been doing as well. And I wish you all the very best as you move forward. For our audience, we now take a break for the next 30 minutes. So feel free to use the networking rooms and or take a break as well. I know fatigue can come on these sessions as well. So feel free to go take a nap, take a walk, whatever you want to do. But after that, we'll start at 1:45 Eastern again. We've got two sessions, one on democratic erosion and governance and the other on considering Indigenous histories as well. So I hope you all have a great afternoon and we'll see you very, very soon.